quote, "A divided mind is an unfocused mind. A divided mind fractures walls and weakens stone. Many divided minds may destroy a city." And this is exactly what happened to the city Dakan used to live in before he came in contact with the Nameless One. Now, obviously, this is all fictional, and it comes, from a, I guess not completely obscure video game. It's won a lot of awards and stuff, but anyway, it was just made up by people. But I absolutely love Dakon's backstory and the history of his people and everything, and that particular line, which has the strength of an aphorism. It has a somewhat biblical or sort of primordial tone to it. It feels almost Paleolithic. But because it invokes the mental rather than the spiritual, it also kind of feels modern at the same time. In the story, the fractured walls and stone part is meant in a literal sense, in the sense that the plane of limbo directly responds to the mental states of people in it. However, it's very still applicable to real life in kind of indirect way. How, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. So most, if not all, human endeavors seem to go better when the people involved have a clear head and are focused on the relevant task or tasks at hand, and when they know what those tasks are and how to complete them. You don't want to be on board, say, a submarine or some other, like a ship, and not be working together cohesively as a team if you're on a crew. Inattention could lead to death for everyone involved. I mean, hit a glacier or what, iceberg or whatever, that kind of thing. Somebody has to be looking out, and so on, Surgeons have to pay attention to what they're doing, or they can maybe cut off the wrong appendage or something, which has actually happened more than once. Quick fun fact, poor handwriting by doctors, by the way, apparently kills thousands of people every year. I found an article that I will link to in the description that alleges that in 2000, also another thing, that alleges in 2011 that cell phones were involved in 23% of all auto accidents. Now, these are just small ways in which basic inattention and lack of focus can mess things up for us. But that's not really the real point of the aphorism, I think. The point of the aphorism is that your thoughts, and particularly your picture of the way things ought to be, they really can't be aligned in contradictory ways, while also being able to keep a sharp focus as a culture, as a whole. In the fictional myth I just told you all about the Gith, there could be no reconciliation between Gith herself and Zerthamon. Gith actually demanded that the people, and particularly Zerthamon, live under one sky on the matter of permanent revolution. Zerthamon agreed with her, saying there cannot be two skies, and then led a huge civil war against her, right? And they were, of course, both right, in a sense. This tearing apart of the Gith people into literally other dimensions is a great symbol of what it's like in the real world. Divided allegiances, especially ideological ones, create a lack of focus, and that lack of focus creates further division, which erodes social relations and civilization itself. Now, I want to be clear about what I'm saying versus what I'm not saying. I'm not saying all disagreement is bad. Okay? The more complex the subject and the further removed from basic fundamental ideas it is, I think the more disagreement you can have without damaging the basic fabric of whatever projects you're working on or of the culture as a whole. However, imagine the state of mathematical culture, say, if say, there was no general agreement that 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, they just wouldn't get very far. Or imagine the state of geology if plate tectonics wasn't accepted by most geologists, or which used to be the case, actually, or for that matter, that the world is round and moving through space rather than like flat and suspended on a turtle's back. These things aren't always accepted, but eventually, you get to the point where they are. And in fact, some of the elites in the field, sometimes they'll mock correct ideas at first. But imagine a world, for example, take it even further, where everyone spoke their own personal language that had nothing to do with anybody else's. I mean, you wouldn't be able to communicate, and things would not go well. So the point is that in these groups, they eventually sort things out, and a new consensus emerges, and then work proceeds, and we can expand on the shared points. Part of the struggle for the modern world and the struggle for civilization, I think, is in getting people on the same page about basic human values. Basically philosophical values. In a way, I find that a great capacity for disagreement that we all have is a great and charming thing about humanity. I mean, we're always trying to figure out new truths, arguing about this and that, and peaceful conflict is fine and even necessary for the advancement of ideas and civilization. But it's really important to realize that after a certain point, you can't have a civilization without some basic agreement on some things, at least widespread agreement, right? I mean, that's part of what makes a civilization a civilization. If half the people think human trafficking is just A-okay, and the other half doesn't, it's not going to go well, right? Or if half the people are stridently opposed to freedom and the rest are for it, or they can't agree on what it means, or so on. A really important one in terms of the symbolism underlying Dacon's history, and therefore his aphorism, I think, is that there has to be some widespread agreement on how disputes themselves shall be settled. And I think this, more than anything else, is what defines the word civilization. You see, most topics are the sort of thing, are more the sort of thing that fractures walls or weakens stone. But some topics are important and fundamental enough to destroy a city, a culture, a nation, or an organized business, businesses, organizations. I think it's worth reiterating that the idea that disputes about truth are to be settled by words and not by swords, to the extent possible. I think that idea is not something that there can be two skies on, because it's so fundamental to what makes civilization what it is. Without at least that basic agreement, it's almost by definition. Being civilized means resolving disputes with words, essentially. That agreement implicitly depends on some other agreements, such as there being some kind of truth, right? Communication is possible, and all these other things. For example, if you have vast swaths of people who actively denounce reason, here I'm saying, I mean it kind of very broadly. I don't mean to be too rigorous. I mean reason as opposed to faith or just arbitrary authority, using evidence, testable hypotheses, and thinking about things clearly. You have to have a common vocabulary about these things in order to uphold this first commandment of civilization, that peaceable disagreement shall be upheld to the extent possible. Right now I look out from the relative safety of my desk out into the real world via the intermediary mechanism of the internet, and I see all kinds of examples of lack of focus and the attempt to have two skies, right? And here's a short list. Revelation versus reason. Universal human rights versus rights as a privilege from ruling powers, or as something to be carved out by force rather than mutually submitted to, or as something to be granted by your ethnicity or wardrobe. Might makes right versus right being worthy of allegiance to for its own sake. Life as being valuable versus boundless cynicism. Sincerity in your relationships with others versus constant irony or habitual lying. Nation states versus locales. Sense versus nonsense. Freedom versus slavery. Let me put it as starkly as I can. Collaboration versus disintegration, as the ways in which we should, regardless of hierarchical status, deal with one another. Now, I actually have a lot more to say about authority per se in another video, what makes it legitimate or illegitimate. But it should be clear that if the authorities in whatever sphere of life under dissection do not have similar goals as their subordinates, then there can be no lasting peace. A civilization full of minds that cannot adhere on the most fundamental questions together, or figure out at the very least a strategy to adhere to when there is no adherence, no agreement, will soon be no civilization at all. So, remember that a divided mind is an unfocused mind. A divided mind fractures walls and weakens stone. Many divided minds may destroy a city. I think that agreement is as important as disagreement, and we ignore Dacon's aphorism at our own peril. So anyway, keep your wits about you, and live under one sky. Peace.